brought before you. Obviously, we have a couple of huge issues in front of us that Pioneer has been focusing on for quite some time. One of which is healthcare. And of course, we have the healthcare law that's before the Supreme Court. On some key questions such as is individual mandate actually something that is constitutional? Other questions like the Medicaid program, the way that it is being expanded, where if you don't accept the expansion, you lose all base funding. Is that something that is a more forceful approach to federal power than we've seen in the past? Is that constitutional? And many other issues that are being debated there. Obviously, that's a huge one. We have a book that just came out March 13th, which is called The Great Experiment, The Feds, the States, and Your Healthcare. It's something that we've been taking around the country, which focuses precisely on this question. What happens if the federal law falls? What do we do then? Are there approaches that actually could be effective? And it really focuses on this question of what is the right relationship between the federal government and the states in devising policies that relate to key issues like healthcare. Another issue that we're very, very focused on is education. Obviously, we do a lot of work on charter schools, vocational schools here in the state, but also one of the things we're very focused on is the federal role in education. And we've seen a monumental growth in the funding of the Department of Education at the federal level, and a much more intrusive stance by this administration in terms of devising standards and tests, and by implication through the tests, curricular materials and instructional practices. So there's sort of a one-size-fits-all that's being advanced at the federal level. Michael is going to be speaking to you about his book, which is called The Upside Down Constitution. It's here. It will be for sale afterwards. And it really gives you an overview of federalism, not just now, but also the history of federalism, its philosophical beginnings, its path throughout history, and its power, if used appropriately and effectively, to actually help shape effective policy in a way that I think is very different from what is possible in many other countries. I'm going to give you a very brief introduction. He is the John G. Searle Scholar at the American Enterprise Institute. He specializes in constitutional law, courts, and business regulation. He also heads the American Enterprise Institute's Transatlantic Law Forum, and he is the chairman of the Competitive Enterprise Institute. He is a frequent contributor on the Liberty Law blog and teaches courses at Johns Hopkins University and also Boston College up here. Prior to his engagement with AEI, as I mentioned before, he co-directed the Center for Individual Rights, a public interest law firm specializing in high-stakes constitutional litigation. He is a graduate of the University of Hamburg in West Germany and earned a Ph.D. in government from Cornell University. Thank you very much for being here. I think you'll find it a fascinating talk.
Thanks, Jim, for that very generous introduction, and thanks to the Pioneer Institute, and thanks to Greg Cody and the Federalist Society for putting this together. As you can see, the Upside Down Constitution is a very long book. It's also a somewhat complex book. Federalism, as Jim just mentioned, figures very prominently in a lot of contemporary debates, starting with healthcare and on to immigration policy. But since this is a book for the ages, there's actually very little about the current controversies in it, although I'd be happy to, although it bears on them, and I'd be happy to answer questions in that regard. But the book is about something different. I mean, on the one hand, it's about federalism, as one of my reviewers said, this book is about federalism the way Moby Dick is about a whaling voyage. There's a lot of constitutional theory, James Buchanan and the calculus of consent and that sort of thing. And on the other side, the book tracks a whole lot of legal doctrines on corporations and on railroad bonds and on public debts and state taxation and federal jurisdiction. There's very little in here about God, guns, and gays. There's a whole lot about debt and fiscal affairs for reasons that I'll explain. What I don't have either is a compelling political or litigation program to restore our tattered constitutional fabric. So in short, it's obvious why you should buy this book. I want the royalties. What I want to explain is why you may want to read it. I think the reason is that there's something very wrong with the way we think about federalism and the Constitution. And by we, I don't mean the faculty of Yale Law School, because that's a given, but also conservative originalists and more broadly the public debate. So let me give you a few examples of what I have in mind. Here's the first example. Conservatives like to think that federalism equals decentralization and devolution, and that means smaller and more accountable and responsible government. Now, you try to tell that to business people who produce stuff and who want to sell it in interstate commerce. To them, federalism means overzealous state attorneys general, it means hellhole jurisdictions, it means regulation by 50 fiefdoms. For anybody who wants to run a productive business in the United States, less federalism would be better. So who is right about this? And is it really true that the founders gave us a constitution that creates this permanent conflict between production values and limited government? Or is it that we have made a mistake somewhere along the way? Here's a second example. For as long as I can remember, conservatives have agitated against unfunded mandates from Washington. So the theory goes that Washington lures the states into cooperative fiscal programs, like in education, and then it fails to fund them, and this destroys the federalism balance. And then you look at the states' briefs in the Obamacare Medicaid litigation. Their argument is that Medicaid is so generously funded under Obamacare at 100% on the dollar that states can't say no. So now all of a sudden it's the funded mandate that destroys the federalism balance. When I was still in the constitutional litigation business, we generally thought it was a good idea to sort out whose side you're on before you file a lawsuit. There's obviously some confusion here. My third example isn't really an example, it's the confusion itself. We're constantly being told that we must protect and restore federalism's constitutional balance. And my question, especially to originalists, is where do you get that from? There are lots of constitutions around the world that do, in fact, federal constitutions that do, in fact, aim at a balance. And what they all have is some equilibrating principle in the Constitution itself. That's true of Germany's Constitution, India's Constitution, the European treaties, if you count them. Look at our Constitution. It has no such principle that tells you what the balance should be, and that omission is conspicuous and it is intended. And note how senseless this sort of federalism as balance talk is. So let's stipulate the feds have taken over a lot of things like land use or whatever that by all rights ought to be left to the states. Should we then restore the balance and make it up to the states by giving states the power to, let's say, declare foreign war? This is not as crazy as it sounds, because that's how the European Union actually works. And even here at home, we've given state attorneys general the power to regulate the economy 50 times over. So what's one more federal power among friends? If ultimately this is crazy, that's because our constitutional federalism isn't designed as a balance. It's designed as a structure that allocates powers and establishes decision rules, and that is a very, very different institutional model. So to bring this to a point in one or two sentences, the Constitution has nothing to say about how much federalism there should be. It has an awful lot to say, if you understand it rightly, about what kind of federalism we are supposed to have. And our problem is that we no longer have that form of constitutional federalism. In fact, the constitutional structure has been turned upside down. And this book tries to explain how that happened and to excavate the Constitution's right-side-up structure. In my remaining minutes here, I'll try to give you the overflight version. So I start where everybody else starts, which is with a federalist, and I start where Publius starts. Some form of federalism, if you're back in 1787, is a foregone conclusion, and the question is, in this constitutional moment of reflection and choice, how do you organize federalism, and to what ends? And the best answer is to organize and understand federalism in continuity with the rest of the constitutional program. You want to make democratic politics possible. You want to guard against its dangers. You want to curb the danger of government monopoly, provide protection against the violence and abuse of faction. And you want to enhance political stability and guard against what Madison called a mutable government. If you want to know what he meant by that, it's kind of like our government. The federalism that answers to these demands is what political economists call competitive federalism. You try to limit the central government to the provision of genuinely national goods, defense. And with respect to all else, you let states govern themselves and compete for productive citizens and talents and their assets. If one state exploits its citizens, those citizens will move elsewhere, and that mobility will constrain government perhaps more effectively than voting. As the political economists say, exit complements voice. Now, the basic structural features of this federalism conform to what Madison called the compound republic. So the central government's powers under our constitution are federal, by which he means that they are enumerated and limited, because if they weren't, there'd be nothing for states to compete over. But that's not the only condition of competitive federalism or the compound republic, nor even the most important. The second condition is what Madison called the national operation of the federal government's powers. It must tax and regulate citizens directly, not through the states, because otherwise state and federal politicians will cooperate, usually for the purpose of obscuring political responsibility for the costs and ill results. I'll come back to that point because it's very, very important. And the third condition is a federal government with sufficient authority and incentives to enforce competitive conditions among states, open borders, coupled with prohibitions against extraterritorial state action, that is to say, state attempts to tax and regulate citizens in other states. So the upside-down Constitution maps this rough conceptual framework onto the Constitution: limited and enumerated powers, the Supremacy Clause, the open economy protections of the Privileges and Immunities Clause, and of Article 1, Section 10. And then it tracks the trajectory of judicial doctrines under these clauses over the 19th century. What I'm hoping is that that discussion will correct two widespread and, I think, fateful misunderstandings. So here's the first misunderstanding. It's really a mistake, especially among conservatives, to think that competitive federalism, the right kind of federalism, necessarily means a small central government and very limited national powers. It may have that result. But if you have to fight a war, or if you have to establish institutions that guarantee the full faith and credit of the United States, the national government won't be so small anymore. Moreover, and more importantly to my mind, if states routinely violate the competitive order, you have to have a way to bring them into line. You need a supremacy clause with teeth. See Martin versus Hunters, let's see. You need a supremacy clause with teeth. As I just said, sorry. You need an expansive dormant commerce clause and a federal preemption doctrine with teeth. That's Gibbons versus Ardman. You need a federal common law to ensure the integrity of credit and commercial paper throughout the United States. See Swift versus Tyson. The 19th century landmark cases suggest the point. What competitive federalism requires is a confident Supreme Court with jurists who comprehend that the Constitution makes the commerce of the United States their business. Here's the second mistake, and I think it's even bigger. The mistake is to think that states as states, that is to say, their political elites and their hangers-on, will defend competitive constitutional federalism unless the feds corrupt them or so. They'll do the opposite. Here's how you want to think about it, I think. Competitive federalism, as I just said, disciplines state governments. If states overtax or overregulate, the victims move. And that's the absolute last thing the political class wants. So what states want is a national government that stands ready to mow down competition on every margin, wherever it may rear its head, and that means an unlimited national government. The catch is this, a national government that is sufficiently powerful to protect the state's surplus is also sufficiently powerful to wipe it out, and you want to guard against that eventuality. So, for example, what you'll want is a federal tax monopoly coupled with a guarantee that some of the money will find its way back to you. You'll want a federal power to blanket the sky with minimum regulatory standards, provided you, as the state, then get to play a role in administering the federal scheme and, moreover, retain power to regulate on top of that scheme. And you'll want a power to tax and regulate citizens in other states, because unlike your own citizens, those people can't run away and they can't vote you out of office. Lo and behold, there you have the central elements of the New Deal Constitution under which we all live. Enumerated powers become limitless. Notice, no state ever resisted that development. All of the famous New Deal cases were brought by private marginal producers, such as the Schechter brothers. In each and every one of these cases, the states supported the expansion of the federal government's power. The feds at the same time got into the business of collecting taxes from citizens and then sending the money back to state political elites. And there's no constitutional defense to that scheme. Federal preemption, that is to say the doctrine that tells us that governs when and to what extent federal law trumps state law, begins to treat the supremacy clause as suspect, to make sure that after the expansion of federal authority, states still get to regulate on top of whatever the feds just did. And states are liberated to exploit the commerce of the United States 50 times over. That is why pro-competitive constitutional clauses disappeared at the time. They're no longer enforceable. The contract clause is no longer enforceable. The compact clause is no longer enforceable. The full faith and credit clause with respect to public acts is no longer enforceable. And above all, that is the point of Erie Railroad, decided in 1938, a case that's absolutely foundational for the New Deal Constitution, and to my mind, one of the Supreme Court's biggest unforced errors ever. Don't tell that to your Civ prof. Let me draw out two unorthodox conclusions from this discussion. So here's the first. Contrary to folklore, and especially conservative folklore, the New Deal Constitution was not a centralizing revolution. Its point in effect was to expand the power of government at all levels, and our constitutional doctrines, as I just said, reflect that, but so does federalism on the ground. State and local revenues now come to 15% of GDP. That's up from 5% in 1950. States collect an ever larger share of their revenues from the federal government. And while no business enterprise or their lawyers worried about state regulators or AGs in 1970 or so, they do worry now, do they ever? Never in American history have states exerted so much power over the commerce of the United States or claimed a greater share of national production. So the standard story of progressive centralization is simply a crock. Here's the second unorthodox implication. Once you view federalism through this what federalism, not how much prism, it becomes easier to appreciate the ideological connotations of federalism as balance. The first time federalism in our modern sense appeared in the United States Supreme Court's opinions was in 1939. The term was quite literally coined by Felix Frankfurter, and the point was to liberate all government institutions from constitutional shackles. The thrust of the program wasn't more or less federalism, it was migration from a competitive constitutional federalism that disciplines government to a federalism, to a cooperative federalism, as Felix Frankfurter called it, that empowers government at all levels and serves as an engine for the growth of government. And every time you say balance, that is the program you've just signed on to. And the only way out is to recognize that it's the kind of federalism and not the degree of centralization that matters. Now, suppose all of this is true. For the most part, this book is about explanation, not prescription, but I make no bones about my conviction that a reversion to a more constitutional, competitive federalism would be a good thing. So what would that take? Well, it's not going to be easy. If you look over the political science, economics literature, it tells you that competitive federalism is inherently unstable. And the reason why it's inherently unstable is that the junior governments will always use their agency in the federal government to lock themselves into these federally sponsored tax and regulatory cartels. And once those cartel arrangements are up and running, they're self-reinforcing. If you want to know what they look like at their climax, Obamacare and Dodd-Frank would be very, very good places to start. These are not socialist centralizing impositions. Rather, they sort of seize on the most dysfunctional features of federalism and then double down. And if you want to see cooperative federalism in an advanced stage of decay and fiscal ruin, Argentina would be a very fine place to start. That country merits close study because that's what I think, because that is where I think we are headed. The question is whether our federalism's pathological tendencies have any limits. I can think of two means of possible correction, and one of them has to do with political economy, and the other one has to do with the way we think about the Constitution. So let me take those in turn. Here's what I mean by political economy. Ask yourself, why is it that in the 19th century competitive federalism did just fine, thank you very much, and wasn't overwhelmed by this constant state attempt to lock themselves into federal tax and regulatory cartels? And the answer to that is something that political scientists call sectionalism. That is to say, a divide among states that blocks their efforts to sort of lock themselves, to run to Washington and say, please regulate us, please tax us, and then tax our citizens and send the money back. And everyone knows what the sectional divide was: slavery, and then, Jim Crow. And so long as those issues hung over American politics, there could be no cooperative federalism. It was only under the unusual conditions of the New Deal that could be overcome. Nobody, of course, wants slavery or Jim Crow back. What I think is happening now in American politics, or maybe happening, is a resurgence of sectionalism, roughly along the old lines, but around very new issues. Not cultural issues even so much, but regulatory and economic issues. Go look at the Obamacare litigation. There are 26 states who are against Obamacare, and they're mostly upset about the Medicaid expansion. There are 12 states on the other side. Go look at the global warming litigation instigated by this fabulous Commonwealth. There are a bunch of states on the other side. Go look at labor regulation or immigration regulation. There's the same state breakdown. It's always the same breakdown. I have a bunch of, sort of did the evidence in a bunch of blogs on my blog. There's a sectional divide between what you, in American politics, among and between states, between what you can call a sort of pro-competitive bloc led by Texas and Virginia, if you want the biggest states, and a sort of pro-cartel, pro-federal government bloc led by California, Illinois, and New York, and an assortment of other basket cases. And if that plays out in American politics, that could be a powerful and potent force for a more competitive constitutional, sensible federalism. The other part I just said is, or the other force that may arrest our federalism's pathologies, is the way we think about the Constitution. Notice this, it's striking that the text of the Constitution provided very little resistance to federalism's inversion or transformation. The conservative mantra is that, well, the New Deal just trashed the text of the Constitution, for example, by expanding the word commerce beyond all recognition. Now, as it happens, I think that Wickard versus Filburn was rightly decided, but even if I am wrong about that, as many of you will think, you can change, and the Supreme Court did change the Constitution's political economy and architecture by not enforcing pro-competitive norms, such as the Contract Clause, the Full Faith and Credit Clause, the Compact Clause, or by manipulating infra-constitutional rules of decision, as in Erie Railroad. And if the bare bones text offered little defense for the right kind of federalism at its demise, it's hard to see how the text can now impel its reconstruction. And for this reason, the upside-down Constitution ends in a plea to rethink originalism, or at least to broaden it. You can't get federalism right until you get the structure right, and you cannot get the structure right without without two things. First, some normative political theory of what the Constitution is supposed to do, and second, a very elaborate set of abstract concrete norms that make a deliberately minimalist Constitution work over the long haul under vastly changed conditions, and with an eye on what John Marshall called the varying crisis of human affairs. Textual analysis cannot possibly do all that work. You need workable common law doctrines, and you need theory. Them's fighting words, of course, among originalists. Once you engage political theory, they say, there'll be more than one theory. There'll be Bruce Ackerman's theory, and then there'll be Mike Greve's theory, and the judges will go ape no matter who wins. And once you allow common law-like doctrines, the text will disappear. And then again, the judges will make it all up. I recognize the force of those objections, but I think it's now time to go beyond them. If the founders had anticipated a modern-day originalism, they would never have written a minimalist constitution or entrusted so much power to the federal courts. If John Marshall had subscribed to what now passes for originalism, there would not be a United States of America. And if you think that legal positivism and this sort of interpretive Calvinism will protect the Constitution, think again. The Constitution will get further and further away from you, not only or even primarily because your opponents will put their spin on the document, but mostly because you have just refused to do the work that the Constitution so obviously demands of you. And so the upside-down Constitution tries to show why this work is worth doing and why I won't cede this constitutional ground. Thank you.
Folks, if you have a question, there's a microphone right here. Just please state your name, your affiliation if you have one, and ask the question.
Good morning and thank you. Peter Antonelli. I'm an attorney here in Boston, member of the Federalist Society of the Boston chapter. Michael, under your view of today's federalism, you mentioned Argentina as a basket case. You also mentioned certain states like Illinois. Does federalism allow states, individual states, to fail, like Illinois, like California, without bringing down the whole country?
That's a very good question. Yes, it does. Excuse me. In part for constitutional reasons, in part for simple economic reasons. Let me start with the economic reason. The reason why I think states are not a big problem is that their debt is mercifully not held by big banks. It's mostly held by individual investors who the state goes bust or defaults on the debt. that's tough for the investors, but it's not a crisis, right? But what causes a crisis is if state debts are held by big banks, right? Germany didn't bail out Greece, it bailed out the Deutsche Bank, right? So the money never left Germany, it traveled from Berlin to Frankfurt, congratulations. If California had a bank that's loaded up with bad California debt, I wouldn't guarantee anything, right? So, and that's a real mechanism for stability. And this again involves many federal systems have state banks that function like that, and they're always a menace. As Argentina, Brazil, Germany even has those. So that's the current economic answer. The constitutional answer is this: there has always been a danger of a bailout, federal bailout in American government, and this is particularly acute, you may think, because the country started with a federal bailout of the states, their war debts, right? Nevertheless, over the history of America, there has been this very firm commitment: we will not bail out states, period. It was established in the financial crisis following the years 1837 to, it lasted all the way to 1843. There were bailout demands. For states had gone belly up, and the debts were held mostly by Dutch and British banks. There were bailout demands because the Brits and the Dutch said, not unreasonably, look, we made these loans in the expectations that you, the federal government, would stand behind them, right? We made them to Pennsylvania and Florida. That wasn't an unreasonable argument, but the federal government still said, tough, suck it up. 2 years later, the credit was restored. It is always restored. And this formed a pattern. States again went bust after the Civil War, not as a result of the war debts, but because of new railroad bond debts. One state, Arkansas, went bust during the New Deal era. It has the distinction of being the only state in America that has defaulted on its debts 3 times. Every time, we've never bailed out states. Now, there are sort of several caveats to that. There are undercover bailouts, okay? And we have, over the past, we don't call them state bailouts, but that's what they were. And we've had a long succession of those kinds of things now. So here are a few examples. The Children's Health Insurance Program, CHIP, or S-CHIP, okay, passed under the Clinton administration. That was effectively a state bailout because it allowed states to shift kids from Medicaid into the even more generously funded S-CHIP program. The drug benefit under the Bush administration was a big bailout. The stimulus bill was a de facto bailout, partial bailout of states. And the biggest bailout to date is Obamacare. The states don't want to admit this, but it's not the Medicaid part of it or any other part, right? It's the exchange provisions in the bill that will allow states come 2014 to roll hundreds of thousands of state and local employees and retirees into these exchange programs and say, hey, you're the federally subsidized problem, you're no longer our problem. And with $550 billion in unfunded obligations hanging over the states for these kinds of programs for their retirees alone, that's a real big thing, and this is why many states were for Obamacare before they were against it. There's a reason that this is a huge thing. Okay, the pre-commitment against bailing out states is a huge thing. It is what distinguishes the United States to this day from Argentina, Brazil, Germany, and a whole lot of other federal systems that are even sicker than ours. The question is whether this will last. One question is whether it will last in light of all these undercover bailouts. You don't have to call them bailout. You can do other transfer things that accomplish the same end. And the second thing is, this is sort of a fine illustration. The reason why I get into this in the book at all is it's a wonderful illustration of the way in which our minimalist constitution, the fact that it's silent on something, protects a competitive, in this case, federal order. If you ask yourself, why is it that the states weren't bailed out in 1837 or 1840? The answer is they could not agree on a bailout formula because the Constitution doesn't provide one, right? Most federal constitutions have a revenue formula, a fiscal constitution, as they call it. So, the income tax is federally collected and then it's divvied up among levels of government. Or particular tax sources are divided up among levels of government. And then there's something called horizontal fiscal equalization, right? Which means that rich states have to send money to poor states, and all of this. It's very organized, it's very sophisticated, and it gives states, whenever they want to be bailed out, a formula around which to rally and to say, this is our bargaining baseline for a bailout. There wasn't anything like that in 1837 because the Constitution was completely silent about it. And so nobody could agree on whether the slaves should count for these purposes and whether the degree of fault that the degree of fraud committed in these states should matter, whether the externality should matter. And over all those disagreements, the whole thing fell apart, right? And it's the constitutional silence that kept things, that allowed the federal government to maintain this pre-commitment against bailout. And the salience and the significance of the New Deal is that it found ways to overcome that problem of no baseline. And the way it did it was, okay, the progressive states that want to be locked into these federal cartels effectively subsidize the states that don't want to, right? They pay a bribe. And so the entire transfer system today is organized in that fashion. That's why states that are wealthy and progressive are actually losers in this fiscal federalism game. New York is a big loser. California is a huge loser. The winners are, states that don't want the system. Kansas, Nebraska, right? Alaska always, but that's a special case. And the reason is they have to be bribed into it, and that's the New Deal formula.
Hi, Crystal Lyons. I'm an attorney here in Boston. With all this talk about the bailouts and kind of the hidden bailouts and everything, I was wondering how you thought illegal immigration should be implicated and how states should carry that burden, particularly when you have, California and Texas as on the opposite sides of what you're saying for arguing for federalism, but faced with the same problem of huge numbers of persons that they have to pay for.
Yeah. No, I'll say two things about that. First, in all the litigation over the state immigration bills, and the second case, as you may know, is being argued this week. There's actually a fair amount of agreement that this is something that has to be a federal responsibility. I mean, immigration, naturalization, the Constitution itself speaks to that, right? The problem is, as many people see it, is that the feds have actually fallen down on that job, okay? And so what you have in the cases is a very intriguing inversion almost of the way people, the political camps generally line up, right? Normally it's the conservatives who are presumed to, or who are supposed to say, everything should be preempted by the federal government so that commerce can continue unmolested. In this case, there's a lot more sympathy for the argument that no, if the feds don't do their job, right, let the states step in and add to whatever the feds have failed to do. I mean, the reason why I'm a little nervous about that argument is that that's what Eliot Spitzer always said. That's what Martha Coakley always says. You know, the feds are falling down. They haven't shut down the local financial institutions yet. I will do so. You know, I'm not terribly fond of that argument. So it'll be very interesting to see how that shakes out. The other, here's another riff on, I mean, constitutional riff on the same theme. How do we get into these state, federal, cooperative arrangements that are so destructive of political responsibility and accountability? How do we get into that in the first place? Why doesn't the Constitution just forbid that, right? And the reason is that, well, there are the constitutional entitlements, there are things that are federal, and everything else has to be left to the states, and there's sort of this implied principle of mutual exclusivity. That's good as far as it goes, but it then turns out that lots of things cannot be done by one level of government alone, right? You want to build a military installation, it has to be built someplace, so you need the state's help. Immigration is another one of those things where, yeah, I mean, the border control itself is one thing, and it's easy to say that should be federal responsibility alone. But what do you do when the borders prove porous, and what do you do with people who violate their immigration status and so on and so forth? It's hard to see how you can run that system without some cooperative arrangement, right? And so you can't just sit, I mean, you can't stand there and be very dogmatic about it, no cooperation ever, right? You need a set of constitutional doctrines that allows you to keep the cooperative arrangements within constitutional boundaries, and that's the generic problem that lies behind these immigration things.
Hi, John O'Leary. I used to serve on a school committee in a local town, and my understanding from the Constitution is that the word education in school doesn't appear anywhere in the Constitution under enumerated powers. You wouldn't think that education would be in any way the purview of the federal government, but there is uniform bipartisan agreement with the notion that, you know, at the local level, state programs are wonderful because it means free money. I don't have to tax the people in the town. And at the state level, federal money is fantastic because that means I don't have to tax the people in the state. And what we get is this, pressure to consistently increase the funding role. And now that's following some of the testing and standardy role within education. How does one go about reversing the political economy that just has this tremendous pressure for more and more federal presence on the funding side of education, and following with that the controls?
Right. You put that point much better than I did. That's what I mean. That's what I meant in saying these things are enormously resilient in the sense that nobody can defect, right? I mean, you know, look, and the schizophrenic, I mean, it's not just the political institutions, it's also most citizens are schizophrenic about it. I mean, at one point I remember, you know, all these mandates from Washington, all these controls, and can't they leave education alone, right? On the other hand, if some representative stepped forward candidate for Congress or the United States Senate stepped forward and said, I propose that the United States government should do the following about education. Nothing. They're not electable, right? So people are very, very schizophrenic about this in all sorts of ways. And the proof of your theory is that, look, I mean, as far as I can see, we've had these programs since the 1960s. You know, every measure of schools has moved basically sideways. And the only line that shows any pulse at all is employees. Right? And that's what these programs are about. I mean, there are lots of interest groups that hang around it. When I mentioned sort of the sectional dynamics in American politics, that's, I think, where the hope is, that some states will simply say, thank you very much, we're not interested anymore. We just won't take it. We just will not take the money. right? And what you want to do and what you want to think about is a genuinely voluntary system that allows states to either opt out, right, or opt into the sort of federally sponsored system. And I think, I mean, I've sort of thought about ways how one would do this. And here's one idea, I mean, a reform idea that might actually work. For any state that does not participate in the federal program, the state's citizens, taxpayers, the individual taxpayers, not the state, the individual taxpayers get a proportionate share of their income tax rebated. Right? And all of a sudden you'd have a real debate at the state level, should we participate in this or shouldn't we? Right? So get away from education because the amounts are too small. Medicaid is about 8% of your tax bill. That's worth fighting over, right? And then you'd have a real choice at the state level, get in or get out. Currently, you don't have that debate because your tax dollars will flow there anyhow. So it's reforms along those lines, and to put this the other way around, what you should not think about. This is another way of rephrasing my basic theme. The standard proposal among conservatives is restore the balance by block granting the programs. And my answer is absolutely not, right? Sure, a block grant allows good states, Indiana, Utah, to do very good things, right? It also allows bad states to do very, very bad things. And there's one bad state, strike that. It's out on the West Coast. I was going to say the Massachusetts on the West Coast. That can do astounding things. So let's suppose they block grant Medicaid, right? This is actually Congressman Bryan's proposal. I can tell you what California will do. It has a huge pent-up demand among its nurses unions and providers and so forth, who after years of being underpaid, which they were, now want to get paid. That's the first thing where the block grant goes. And then California will throw the most vulnerable members of the Medicaid population off the rolls, and then it will scream, you know, this program has failed because it was brought to you by all these, right-wing nutcase conservatives. The widows and orphans are dying in the streets. It takes 2 E.J. Dionne columns in the Washington Post to say, come to think of it, we have to adjust the Medicaid caps upwards. And lo and behold, that provision is already in most of the proposals that I've seen to block grant these programs. Don't go there. That's just a prescription for abuse at the state level, right? Don't think about the balance. Think about disentangling states in Washington. Don't think about balance.
Michael, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Fabulous. There are books here if you'd like to purchase them. Michael will be over here with a pen in hand, putting his John Hancock on it. I want to just bring to your attention 2 events that are coming up. One has a date, one does not have a date. I'll highlight the one that doesn't have a date first. Our Better Government competition this year, we're scheduling it for September. I think you'll find it of interest given the topic that we've talked about here today, which is about federalism, how to restore federalism to our various programs. And it has garnered about 200 different entries from around the country, some fantastic scholars. I think you'll be pretty impressed with what you'll see come out of that. That'll be in September. We're still working on the speaker, and we'll let you know more soon. The second one is an event that's coming up on May 10th. It's Thursday, 3 to 6 p.m. It's called The Power of the U.S. Supreme Court, a Civics Lesson, and it has a keynote address by Willard Stern Randall, who's a professor and a biographer of George Washington, Jefferson, Franklin, Hamilton. And there's also Jeff Schiessel, who is someone who wrote Supreme Power, Franklin Roosevelt versus the Supreme Court. It's part of an effort that we've had underway to highlight the United States history as a piece of our core curriculum here in Massachusetts. It is not being implemented by the current administration. It is the law of the land. It's something we've been working on for probably about the last 4 or 5 years to make sure they follow through. The tests are all prepared. It would cost about $2.5 million out of a budget that's more or less $9.5 billion spent on education. We think that given that it's the law, and given the fact that our other standards have led to really impressive increases in math and science and English reading, it should be done. So it's a part of that campaign. We'll be releasing some polling there of history teachers in Massachusetts, views also of legislators and also views of citizens on the teaching of history. I think that's a fascinating one. It builds on some of the stuff we're talking about here today. With that, I thank you very much for being here this morning, and please come up and buy a book.